So during the course of working through A Link to the Past's dungeons, I have largely not acknowledged the Game Boy Advance re-release of the game, which released in 2002 bundled with 4 swords. The reason for this lack of acknowledgement was simply that I never played it. I never had a GBA back in the early 2000s, but a couple of my friends did. So my experience with this release was simply being able to occasionally weasel my way into their play sessions of 4 swords. And that was only a handful of times. And while I would later acquire a GBA and cartridge of this game for myself well into my adult years, it wasn't really feasible to record footage like this. That is, until it was added to the Game Boy Advance catalog of Nintendo Switch Online. So yes, I did play through the entire game again in a weekend, take notes, and gather some footage in order to add an extra little addendum to this video. Because here's the thing, the Game Boy Advance version of A Link to the Past has an extra dungeon, which means that despite all of the times I've played A Link to the Past over the years, there is technically a single dungeon I had never played before. The Palace of the Four-Sword, which is unlocked after beating Ganon and rolling credits in A Link to the Past itself, as well as defeating Vati and finishing up Four Swords, all making for a very eventful weekend. Before jumping into the dungeon, a couple of things to address with the GBA version of the game overall. There may be a little nostalgia intertwined here with this opinion, but the original SNES release is still going to be my preferred version to play. The GBA screen crunch reduces the overall visibility of your surroundings, and the audio is noticeably more compressed here than on the SNES, making it feel like a claustrophobic and technically inferior version of the game, though it can't ever be overstated just how remarkable the Super Nintendo sound chip was for its time. For the most part though, this isn't too much of an issue. I was still able to thoroughly enjoy my playthrough of the game, but I can tell that this game was not designed with these limitations in mind, whereas original GBA titles would build their sound design around those technical parameters. Oh, and I hate that they added these voice clips for Link. They're right out of Ocarina of Time, but they sound so horrendously compressed on the GBA. Given the speed at which Link can slash his sword, unlike in the 3D titles, they just feel so out of place. The screen crunch also occasionally gets in the way of puzzles. In this cave in the original version, you can easily see that you need to hookshot across this gap, but on the GBA, you can't even see the other side of the gap. So you either have to go in with prior knowledge like me, or you'd have to essentially just guess. I don't love that, but there are some legit improvements here in this version of the game as well. I previously complained about this one puzzle in Misery Mire, where you have to drop down to the floor below, and the fix that I had proposed when I wrote that is actually exactly what they did in this version. I also quite like that they show the dungeon names at the entrances now, so there's no argument about what Thieves Town is actually called here. And the boomerang cuts grass now, which is so weirdly satisfying. And you actually get to keep the shovel permanently. Oh hey, Maple is here now too. The infamous Ice Palace puzzle got a complete overhaul as well. I haven't yet decided if I like this change or not though. It feels a bit like a lateral move. It fixes it in some respects. There's no way to mess up the puzzle and have to do it again, but you are still forced to take a lap through this section of the dungeon, and the method of using the Cane of Samaria to skip the puzzle is entirely removed. Still, it's clear that the devs thought this puzzle stank and decided to try redesigning it, and I respect that. I just don't know if it's really an improvement. Otherwise, this is largely still the A Link to the Past that we all know and love, and I do feel that it's a perfectly valid way to play the game, but I think for my own enjoyment, that I'd rather just stick with the SNES version. So, now that I've gotten all of my general thoughts out there, I guess we should really look at the biggest difference in this version, the completely new dungeon. So, let's head inside. Welcome to the Palace of the Four Sword. So this dungeon is pretty good. After the chain chomp filled foyer, there is a large central room that essentially has 4 branching paths from it. At the end of each path is one of the 4 swords. Once each sword is collected, a path towards the boss fight is unlocked. You can do these 4 sections in any order, as they are all self-contained and not locked off. In this way, it resembles the dungeon structure of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom more than anything else in A Link to the Past itself. If you swapped out these swords for, say, a terminal, yeah, this would basically be a divine beast, but in 2D. In fact, it's especially like the Final Trial, the DLC dungeon for Breath of the Wild. Do I think this is a bad thing? No, not really. I don't dislike those dungeons for the most part, and this is the only dungeon like this in this game. So that's more of an observation than a complaint. Plus, it's really meant to be a bonus challenge, and so it structures itself as somewhere between a gauntlet and a boss rush, with repurposed elements from other dungeons being used to craft more devious puzzles and remixed boss battles at the end of each of the 4 paths. Visually speaking, the dungeon borrows most of its architecture and aesthetics from the Palace of Darkness, the first Dark World dungeon in the game, with some of its decor taken from other spots, like these skeletons on the wall, which are from Skull Woods, and these fountains from the Swamp Palace. This place also uses the same usual Dark World dungeon music, which is a bit of a disappointment. We've already gotten 8 dungeons in a row with this song, and this would have been a good opportunity to at least remix it, right? If not, give us an entirely new track. The level design here is pretty good though on a room-to-room basis, particularly with the puzzles. While I'm usually more of a fan of there being some sort of navigational challenge, I think the game has already given us our fair share of that in its other Dark World dungeons. Here, instead we've got individual room puzzles that put a twist on familiar elements, and even make use of mechanics that were either in the original game but had no real purpose, or were underutilized. There are very few times where diving is actually necessary, but you've got to do it here to avoid this spike trap. And did you know you can break pots with arrows? I didn't, not until I was doing this dungeon and had to. And the Cane of Sumaria in particular gets some really good uses. You could always use it to create blocks and hold down floor switches, but now you've got to pick up and throw it, or actually use the beam function when you dispel it, which is quite literally never needed in the base game. Using the Pegasus boots to bounce off of walls was always there as a little exploit for getting into Misery Mire early, but it was never meant to be an intended puzzle solution in the original game, but here we need to do it in order to get over some gaps. There's also a puzzle here that is very similar to one from Skull Woods, but this time we've also got to use the hook shot. You may have surmised, but the puzzles here are quite a lot of fun. They almost have a sort of freshness to them, like they're new takes on mechanics that I'm already familiar with. And there's something really charming about that. I still hate ice physics though. The dungeon also has a pretty strong combat emphasis. The enemies here are some of the toughest around, like Hardhat Beetles, Stalfos Knights, Zazaks, and Terrorpins. Though maybe they got a little too trigger-happy placing Bari around here, there are tons of these guys. Oh, and there are like-likes here. I don't think there are any like-likes in the original game at all. Though, considering this is essentially a post-game challenge, it would have been pretty cool to see even tougher enemies in here, like Gibdos and Lynels. Of course, we can't talk about the combat challenge without addressing the 4 boss rematches. In no particular order, there is Argus, originally from the Swamp Palace, Blind from Thieves Town, Mothula from Skull Woods, and the Helmasaur King from the Palace of Darkness. While recycled bosses don't sound too exciting, I think a more accurate description would be remixed bosses, as they're all changed to be more difficult. Argus no longer has rocks protecting him. Now they're Bari, which kind of reminds me of Baronade from Ocarina of Time actually. And when he moves into his second phase, there are these water globules that will keep spawning to attack you, making it far more hectic. Oh, apparently these guys are named Cameron? I'm gonna call him Cameron. Blind is probably the boss with the least changes. He still does the same decapitating fireball and laser beam thing, but now you've got to knock his heads back into his body. So there's a neat strategic element there. Oh, and instead of being disguised as the maiden, he instead disguises himself as your uncle, which is neat. Uncle's dialogue from the start of the game was actually altered in the GBA version, but in this bit where Blind is impersonating him, they use the original SNES dialogue as a cheeky little reference. I like that. Mothula is totally different now. In Skull Woods, Mothula himself was not too hard, but that was made up for by a very hazardous arena. This time the arena has nothing going on, but Mothula will duplicate into 3, move much more erratically, and also there's bees. Finally, the Helmasaur King now attacks far more aggressively, summons little Helmasaurs to attack you, and has an additional phase where his mask regrows and has to be broken again. Also, Eyeball. The 4 bosses also get a new coat of paint, being unified in a green and orange color palette, which makes them a bit distinct from their original dungeon boss counterparts, so that's neat. Overall, these guys are fun to refight, but the real challenge is still ahead. So, with all 4 of these guys re-defeated, and by extension all 4 swords collected, we can break this barrier, cross this invisible bridge, and confront the dungeon boss. This is it. Our final challenge. We'll be facing off against Dark Link. Well, 4 Dark Links, actually, corresponding to each of the 4 swords, and each getting more difficult than the last. Being Dark Link, they are basically recolored sprites, but each retaining the color corresponding to the 4 links of 4 swords, though in A Link to the Past's art style. I like this fight. It's a legit challenge, and they put a bunch of Link's own tools to use here. They can attack with their swords, as you'd expect, but also use the Pegasus boots, and this bigger version of the spin attack. They use a down thrust, sort of like Zelda 2, but with the animation of when you're using the Quake medallion. Oh, and they even whip out the magic cape, and sometimes jump backwards to avoid attacks. This is fantastic. Of course, they do cycle out one at a time. I think if you fought all 4 at once, that it would simply be too overwhelming. But they use that pacing to keep scaling up the movesets and difficulty. So, well done. This is truly a great fight. One that will put even the most skilled A Link to the Past players to the test. In fact, during this playthrough, I went and bought these 4 potions before heading into Turtle Rock, and I didn't end up dipping into any of them until this dungeon, and by the end of it, I had used all 4 of them up. It's actually pretty refreshing to play A Link to the Past and be challenged in that way again. Other than that, I don't have too much more to say about this battle. It is really fun, and genuinely challenging in the best way possible, which fits for what is essentially a post-game bonus challenge. So that's it. Once all 4 Dark Links are defeated, an alternate version of the credits will roll, bringing our time with A Link to the Past to a close. So overall, the Palace of the Four-Sword is a pretty short dungeon, but what it lacks in length, it makes up for with some very well-tuned challenges. From items that get put to use in new and creative ways, to remixed bosses that pack an extra punch, to a final sword duel, this dungeon remains a consistent challenge start to finish in a great way. I really enjoyed my brief time in this dungeon, if not for the challenge, then for the strange joy of being able to experience something new that I never had before, within the context of A Link to the Past, a game that I'm otherwise intimately familiar with. I've been sleeping on this one for too long. So this brings dungeon design in A Link to the Past to a close for real this time. It's a little bittersweet. I'd like to thank you all so much for taking the time to watch this, especially if you got this far. Special thanks goes out to my channel members here on YouTube, as well as my supporters on Patreon. Thank you to Greymage, Brenda, Tetra, Justin, Midnight Naomi, Bunny, Stefan, Avery and their ATHDs, as well as all of the folks whose names you're seeing on screen right now. You guys are awesome. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Bye-bye.